Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hello, and welcome to a special paddle court session today. This webinar will be covering all things from planning, noise, and lighting on paddle court planning applications. My name's Ryan Carroll. I'm an Associate Director here at DFL, specialising in lighting impact and lighting strategy for environmentally sensitive planning applications. There's still a few people piling in, but we're gonna get going just because we're conscious of time. So the main thing really with projects that are relating to paddle, we're seeing that the ones that have a high level of success are those that have had a really good level of collaboration on them. So we really do say collaboration is the key to success. And what you may see on screen now is a variety of other disciplines that are all likely at some stage to input into paddle court planning projects. But today we're going to focus on sort of the key three that pop up quite regularly, that being planning, noise, and lighting. Whilst those other disciplines, it's worth you being aware of. So I'm joined by Philip Atkins of Planning Resolution and Ben Dimmock of Air and Acoustic Consultants, and I'm going to hand over now to Philip, who will cover all things planning. And then just to let you know, this session is being recorded, so a recording will be available at the end. And if you do have questions as we go through the presentations, please pop them in the chat. And what we'll do is we'll cover them off at the end in the question and answer session, as many as we possibly can for you. Okay, well, without further ado, I'll hand you over to Philip.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan, and welcome everybody. My name is Philip Atkins. I'm a Principal Director of Planning Resolution. We're a small niche practice that specialises in hotel and leisure development. And over recent years, we've started doing an awful lot of paddle development. I actually started playing paddle 10 years ago myself when I was on holiday in Spain. I'm sure like many of you, and now I'm very pleased to be advising site owners, investors and operators like yourselves in the development of paddle. Over the next 15 minutes, I will try to do the impossible and outline the general planning policy position that applies to paddle development and some of the issues and pitfalls that often arise in securing planning permission. So I will start by saying, whilst paddle might look like a small version of tennis with 4 walls, getting from the concept to consent is anything but straightforward. I always think of planning as the game before the game. And when you're looking at noise, lighting, design, transport, ecology and flood risk, and local politics, these are your opposition, the other side of the net. So let's start looking to begin with at the strategic policy position as it relates to planning and paddle. Well, at a national level, the direction of travel is generally positive. As you can see, these are quotes from the National Planning Policy Framework, and the NPPF actively supports sport, health, and the reuse of land for recreation. So in principle, paddle aligns well, but as always, the devil is in the detail, and it's how this policy is interpreted locally that is key. And as usual, this is where the problems can start, depending upon where your paddle site is proposed. So if you're in the main urban area, surely you should be okay. Well, as some of you may know, you've then got to look at the relevant local plan policies, and this is where things can get tricky. Paddle creates jobs and activity, but it's still classed as leisure rather than an employment use. That means you often are fighting policies designed to protect employment land or buildings. And in those cases, as identified in the bullets here, you'll need to demonstrate that there's a lack of demand for that existing light industrial or office use, and that there has been long-term vacancy in marketing. And most of the policies for that require 12 to 24 months of abortive and full marketing. And also, even if you overcome those, you've then got to identify wider benefits of the proposal to justify the departure. And that normally, and we'll come on to this later, relates to community benefits, the lack of demand, or sorry, the excessive demand for paddle to help the case. So I'll come back to that in a little while, but it's not all doom and gloom. And there is one actual quick fix that many of you may know about in planning, which is that there is an exception. One of the quickest ways to deliver paddle is to find an unfettered Class E building. And by that, I mean a light industrial or a retail unit with a high bay warehouse, close to the town centre, and with good car parking. As movement within a single use class, and the use class here is Class E that covers light industrial buildings and indoor sport, doesn't normally require planning permission. And I say normally, please check that there are no conditions, legal agreements or covenants that might otherwise stop you moving within that. And even if you've looked and you're happy, make sure that you ask your planning consultant to secure a certificate of lawfulness, which means that you ask the council formally to approve the fact that planning permission isn't required for the alternative use. So that deals generally with urban locations. What if you want to start looking for a paddle site further afield? Well, as stated earlier, planning policy normally requires indoor leisure, in particular, to be located in or near town centres. If not, and you are proposing an indoor paddle scheme on a new build site out of town, there's one additional requirement that you will need to look at. You'll need to look at a sequential test. So what that means is that the council and the government want you to firstly identify these town centre uses and put them in the town centre. If not, you put them on the edge of centre. And if there's no sites there, you're allowed to put them in on the out of centre locations. And as part of that assessment, you need to show that there are no suitable sites, and also that there's no trading impact on the existing town centre itself. So that covers the general locational issues and requirements. What about the general planning considerations that come into effect when you're looking at sites? I'm going to look at the main ones now, but I'm going to leave these really on noise and lighting to my colleagues. We'll come back to this, but it's worth saying, as I think most of you know, that paddle is louder than most people expect. The sound is impulsive, it's irregular, and frankly, on the basis that I live next to a paddle development, quite more annoying than tennis. There's also no UK specific guidance. Planners rely on proxies, which can make noise a key planning battleground, and it's always the main one. It's up to 80 decibels and it's impulsive. And to give you a comparison, if you haven't played it yet, it's the equivalent of two people shouting at each other. So it's what neighbours experience daily, and often the main reasons that objections arise. The second most common area is the one that's going to be dealt with also subsequently is in relation to lighting. If you're the operator or developer, lighting's great. Floodlights are great. They extend play, they increase your revenue late into the evening, but they also clearly introduce impacts. Impacts on amenity as a result of the visibility of the floodlighting, the glare, and also that light impacts upon the ecology. So that moves me nicely onto ecology itself. Ecology is increasingly coming front and centre. Lighting and noise affect wildlife behaviour, and they often also fragment habitats, local areas where the animals move from one area to another. And even in urban and suburban areas, they aren't exempt, as they often include or abut woodlands, grassland or waterway areas. And as such, in planning and assessment, you will also need to carry out a preliminary ecological appraisal and surveys. And by surveys, I mean normally looking at bats, newts, and other elements that you need to be aware of. And when you're looking at those, and bats in particular, be aware that there are only times of the year that you can undertake those surveys, normally between April and October. So when you're looking at a site, and if you're pursuing a planning application, be aware there are timescales which are critical to submit your application. And if you do find that with lighting in particular has an impact on bats, there are options that you have for mitigation. You can reduce the lux levels from the lighting down to a lower level. You can put directional lighting on the floodlights. You can put restrictions so that when you leave the court, they turn off. You can put shielding. And for other animals, and this is newts, Generally, you can also opt for translocation. You can take the newts from your site and move them to another location with agreement from the council and from the Environment Agency. So that moves me seamlessly onto biodiversity. For Padel, so let me start again. Currently, a BNG, a biodiversity net gain uplift, is required from most development sites. So you now need to leave biodiversity better than you found it by at least 10%. And that's through on-site enhancement by putting additional greenery, or if you can't provide it on-site, there is an acceptance for a payment off-site through credits. And for Padel, like most developments, the starting point is what's the existing situation you find on site? Is it a car park? Is it a former hard tennis court? That's very different from a greenfield site because clearly there will be less credits that you have to provide. And due to the size of many Padel schemes and locations on hard standing, you might also be able to use the exemption rule. So if you look at the slide, the exemption rule is where you've effectively got most of the site is made up of hard standing and there's very little greenery. So, and also if you've got only 25 square meters or less of greenery, you can argue that actually that it's not appropriate and you don't have to provide the BNG or any form of payment. So that's worth looking at. And also be aware that when you draw your red line for where your site is, don't draw it so you also include landscape areas that aren't actually going to be affected by your scheme, because then they will be counted. The next area I want to briefly cover is transport. Padel has a much higher density of use than tennis. It's mainly played by 4 people, doubles, and in suburban and town centre locations, sorry, let me say that again. In suburban and out of town locations, most people will drive. It's a very sociable game, which results in greater dwell time. So what you get is an overlap between users who are currently playing and those that arrive early to watch, and those people who've played staying late. As a result, as opposed to, for instance, a tennis court where you might get 4 people driving, actually you get up to 10 or 12 people potentially being required to be met in terms of car parking numbers. There are some options. If you happen to be providing a Padel scheme co-located on a football area or a rugby pitch, very often then when they are playing their sports, you can mitigate it by agreeing with the council that you won't hire out your paddle courts at the peak times so that you don't have an overload on car parking. The alternative is that you also can stagger the hiring and use of your own paddle courts to put them on the hour and every half hour. So half the courts actually mean that you have less impact in terms of car parking impact. The next area we should briefly look at is flooding. All land is classified by the Environment Agency as either flood zones 1, 2, or 3, low probability, medium probability, or high probability. And as an operator, you'd find that courts and water don't mix well. So even in low risk areas, when we're looking at planning out and designing new paddle centres, we always look and encourage clients to very early look at drainage and sustainable urban drainage as well, because the design of those is critical. And when you move into the higher flood zone areas, such as 2 and in particular 3, you will be dealing with the local authority and the Environment Agency, who will then be asking for sequential testing, i.e. why do you have to provide it here, resilience measures and technical scrutiny. And in reality, in flood zones 3, you are very unlikely to get consent for paddle development. So if possible, pursue paddle schemes in zones 1 or 2. So where else are there planning issues or locations that can be troublesome? Well, a lot of the schemes that we're working on happen to be located in the Greenbelt. And Greenbelt development is all about balance. So if you're looking at open recreational use as general development, and that includes uncovered paddle courts, these are normally deemed by the local authority to be appropriate use in the Greenbelt. But notwithstanding that in principle acceptance, you're still going to have to look at all the things we've just been talking about, design, land use, transport. But you've also got to look in the Greenbelt at what the impact will be on the loss or potential loss of openness, and spatial and visual impact. And in such cases, you also need to identify a need and demand, and that's where you should liaise with the LTA to make sure that you've got their support in terms of there is a demand and a need, and a support from the LTA to justify your scheme. You also need to identify additional community benefits, and that would be speaking to the local schools, the charities, and having that as part of a community statement. If you're dealing with covered paddle courts in the Greenbelt, that's a much tougher sell. They're a built form, they're permanent, and they're visible. So the planning case has to be very compelling. It normally needs to also be co-located with other existing sporting facilities or buildings. And you'll need to build a major argument in relation to need, health, community benefits, and lack of alternative sites as well. So in those cases, the decision comes down to whether your very special circumstances are strong enough to overcome the in-principle harm. It's also worth saying that on some sites, you may also be able to look at the possibility of running an argument that the land itself is what we call grey belt. You may well have seen this being argued for the loss or release of sites for housing, or that the site is previously developed. And in those cases, it's a different planning argument, and we'd be very happy to offline give you further guidance on those. So what about developing paddle on existing recreational sites? A lot of the clients that come to us have been in discussion with football clubs, rugby clubs, golf clubs, and they want to develop it as a co-location. Well, the answer is generally positive, but you still need to address all the aforementioned planning, design, transport, land use issues, and also make sure that you satisfy Sport England. Sport England is the statutory consultee that you have to approach and has to be and they also comment on all proposals relating to recreational land. And they are generally on your side. They recognise the health and social benefits and support modernising facilities. But, and it's a really big but, if you are impacting or potentially impacting on playing fields, Sport England can become a major hurdle. Their protection policies are very strict, and you'll need robust evidence to show that the paddle delivers greater benefits than the existing use. And that will require you, as the slide shows, to show evidence that there's no loss of playing field space. You could rearrange sporting pitches, if appropriate, to allow you to put your paddle on. You would also must demonstrate neutral or over provision of the football pitches or rugby pitches in the area. And also you'll need the strategic support of the LTA. So finally, going to a wider area, the most sensitive areas are the protected landscapes, and that's got a really high bar. And the main role in the national parks and national landscapes, which we used to call the AONB, is to conserve and enhance the natural beauty, wildlife and cultural heritage. So additional requirements in these locations are to look at the visual impact, the dark skies, and the ecological sensitivity, all of which come into play. But the overriding requirement in these areas is to be landscape-led. So as such, lighting, ancillary structures, parking, and everything else are highly sensitive. And landscape impact and design quality in these locations aren't optional, they are essential. So I'll come to my final slide now, and my final slide really ties all of these elements together, and that relates to consultation, discussion. We would always recommend to clients that they pursue a pre-app and consult with all the statutory consultees, local residents, ward councillors. Involve yourself in the local politics. Good engagement can make or break a scheme. It can identify issues early and involve the community and turn their concerns into solutions. So planning isn't just about policy, it's about people. And remember, these people ultimately are your future paddle club players and members. So you want to take them with you, whatever, from day one, because you want them to be supportive, not only in terms of your application, but come and join your club as soon as you built it. So that is, in 15 minutes, is a very quick overview in relation to the main proposals as they relate to planning. I'll now very happily pass on to my colleagues who will take you through lighting and noise. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Hello, everybody. My name's Ben Dimmock. I'm Director at Air and Acoustic Consultants. And this afternoon, I'm going to discuss with you some noise considerations with regards to Padel and Padel planning applications and how it can be considered appropriately to provide a successful development or in support of a successful development. I'm going to try not to use too much technical jargon in this presentation for everyone's sake, really. But if that is something that anyone's particularly interested in, get in contact and we can discuss those more finer details separately another time. To start off with, a common thought that a few people in noise and just generally used to have when Padel started becoming popular in the UK was, well, what are the noise issues? Are there any? It's just like tennis, right? But then we started getting comments like this, or headlines like this appearing in the press. Now, I'm not putting this up there to scare anyone or to put anyone off going for a development, but I'm using that more as a stepping stone into discussing noise differences and considerations that would be useful to consider when planning your Padel development. There are similarities and differences between tennis and Padel. They're both racket sports, they've got similar rules, similar scoring and kind of approach to gameplay, but there are differences. Padel features longer, more frequent extended rallies. Serving is underarm, so there's less preparation needed between each point. It's played within a boxed court, so there's less time between points when you're trying to find a ball, for example. It's also that boxed court, it becomes its own sound source, and that's something to take into consideration. Tennis has more powerful serves, but these shots are less frequent. You're allowed to rebound off of those glass walls, as mentioned, and this needs to be considered as an alternative and a new sound source. The courts are physically different sizes, so you can fit more gameplay into the same area as you could with tennis. Padel also tends to be faster, more competitive, and a more intense gameplay, therefore more frequent noise events. Padel is also intended to be played as doubles, which also contributes to the more shots per rally when you might compare it to a typical tennis singles match. And as discussed before, although some of the sound characteristics may be similar between tennis and Padel, they are generally louder. So what does all this mean? Well, there's probably enough of a difference to invoke a reaction from surrounding receptors, even if there were existing tennis courts nearby originally. There's probably enough of one that it should be treated as a new type of sound source. It does mean that there is a risk that adopting it's basically tennis mantra means that you might underestimate the level of impact on your neighbours, and therefore the level of complaints and opposition your application may draw. So understanding these differences, along with how to form an assessment and meaningful planning application, is important to be able to provide a risk profile or site suitability assessment for clients and potential developers. When we do that, what do we assess to? As Phil mentioned earlier, there's no existing guidance to follow or to latch on per se. But we can have a look at what's out there at the moment and see if we can draw inspiration from that to form a good assessment methodology. For example, the Lawn Tennis Association guidance provides a roadmap for tennis clubs that are seeking planning permission, and it emphasises the importance of early research, stakeholder consultation and professional advice. It also shows the type of development where planning permission might be required, for example, when resurfacing or putting up fencing, that kind of thing. The document mentions the installation of paddle courts, and it says that a sound attenuation may be necessary if neighbouring properties are within 50 metres of the site in order to mitigate noise impact. We could also have a look at the Sport England guidance. For artificial grass pitches, it gives examples of a 50-metre distance, at which point a full noise impact assessment is probably highly likely going to be required. It also sets a noise limit of LAEQ 50 dB at residential areas as a reasonable target. I said I wouldn't go technical, but just to state on that particular metric, the LAEQ, that's an equivalent sound level averaged over a period of time. And we've seen that 50 dB limit being commonly adopted by local authorities to determine what may be acceptable within residential areas. But is that level always appropriate? Other guidance we could reference that you may all be familiar with is the Dutch guidance. Now, this was the first national level guidance document for Padel anywhere, and we see that it's quite often cited in objections to paddle developments. When we look through the document, there are fixed noise criteria for different times of the day, as can be seen in the chart on screen at the moment. But note now there are two noise metrics to consider. There's that averaged assessment level that we saw in the Sport England guidance, but there's now also a maximum noise level, which deals with more instantaneous, impulsive noise events, like the ball striking the paddle, that kind of thing. There are also example distances that are given in the Dutch guidance that may be acceptable to meet this criteria. For example, if introducing two paddle courts, it suggests a 100-metre distance would usually be enough to meet the project targets. It also gives other target distances for situations where you're putting single courts into quiet residential areas, rural areas, mixed areas, and that kind of thing. That 100-metre distance is quite often cited in objections to paddle courts. So we can see that there are some basic guidance considerations to look at, but does this broad brush approach make sense? It's important to note that so far all the figures that we've discussed are absolute. It's not given any consideration to the soundscape of where those paddle courts may be going or what sensitive receptors may be experiencing already. So could that be an issue? Simply, yes, or at least very probably. Sound is all about context. It's all relative. An analogy that is quite useful to think about is that of a torch at different times of the day. If you had a torch on in the middle of a bright, sunny summer's day, you might not even notice it's there. But the same torch in the same place, but at night time, is going to be stark, very noticeable. You're going to know it's there. Coming back to sound, with that kind of idea in mind, you can see why it may be important to understand what the existing sound climate is like in the area that you're proposing your paddle development. We could maybe think about what's there already. Is there tennis? Is it a rural area? Is it an urban area? Is it built up? Are there residential units? Is it an industrial area? So with that kind of context in mind, is there anything else we can draw upon when trying to frame a positive and meaningful planning assessment? Going back to the NPPF, this aims to ensure that a new development is appropriate for its location, and it considers likely effects of pollution on health and living conditions. Some of the key principles are to avoid significant adverse impacts on health and the quality of life, to use mitigation to reduce noise so that other adverse impacts are kept to a minimum, and to protect areas of tranquility which have remained relatively undisturbed by noise. A key tenet of the NPPF is the agent of change principle, which essentially says that if a person or a business is bringing a new use into an area, they are responsible for making sure that that use does not impact on what's already there. For example, if there's a music venue being introduced into a residential area, the onus is on the music venue to demonstrate that they will not cause an impact on that residential area. But vice versa is also true. If a residential area comes close to the existing music venue, then it's on the residential area to demonstrate there'll be no impact with future occupants. We can also look at the planning practice guidance for noise, the PPG. It's a practical tool where if the NPPF tells us what to do, the PPG tells us how to do it. It's a web-based resource that provides technical depth to support the NPPF policies. And when identifying impact, the PPG introduces the concept of the noise exposure hierarchy, like the table that's presented on the screen at the moment. And it's a table that helps planners and acousticians categorize noise into different levels. We could look at the noise policy statement for England. It's a high-level document that actually came up with the Lowell and Sol terms that you can see on the screen in the table at the moment. And when we look at the noise exposure hierarchy table, we can see that it presents the effect that noise may have on people's day-to-day lives and what should be done where noise results in significant changes in behaviour and amenity. So when it comes to paddle and noise for paddle and the impact it may have on its surrounding receptors, we can see that it may be a good idea to aim for this at the top here and avoid this. When we look further into the text in this table, we can see that it mentions perceived change and acoustic character of the area. So it's quite easy to see how this could differ from site to site. If we quickly remind ourselves of that torch analogy, bring that into our minds, think about context, and then have a look at a couple of example sites where we might want to present a new paddle club. And when we do this, let's say we're looking at the Dutch guidance values and the Sport England's values as thresholds, take them at face value, and then have a look at what the impact may be. So we've introduced some paddle courts into a certain area. The averaged LEQ time level over time is predicted at 48, and those maximum events are predicted at 68. Is that okay? Well, Sport England would say yes, and the Dutch guidance would say no, not in the evenings or the nighttime. So what do we do? Which one is right? Are either of them right? Are any of them wrong? Let's look at some context around those numbers. And let's put them into an existing sound climate. Now I've traced out those average levels as the green dashed line and the maximum levels as the yellow dashed line and compared it to existing average levels at the bottom and maximum levels in that area in red. Now for this particular site, you can see that they're kind of getting lost between what's already there, that existing soundscape. And for some context, this represents a busy urban area. Ambient condition levels are about 52 at AEQ, maxes range from about 55 to 88. There are also football pitches in the area. There are also tennis courts in the area, and there's a lot of leisure uses nearby. So not only are we predicting that the paddle noise levels are going to be controlled to a point where it's not going to be the dominant noise source, it's also any sound that could be heard is likely to be congruous with the existing sound climate, something that is familiar, or at least familiar in level, with the surrounding receptors. So this seems like quite a compelling case for presenting a successful application where the context of the site, backed up by standard levels that are referenced from Sport England and the Dutch guidance, are used. So let's say, for example, that we present this and it's a success. We've presented our assessment, we have permission, and we're operating without any complaint. It's fantastic news. We know what we're doing. Let's expand. Let's build the next one. What worked before will surely work again. Or is that the case? Those same predicted levels are now overlaid a different site. What you might be able to see straight away is that the noise levels here are quieter. All of a sudden, what we predicted is that average level for paddle is quite significantly above the average levels that are already in that site. You can see the maximum levels for paddle, they're not the loudest thing there, but they're louder than most things that are there. For a bit of context for this site, there's no leisure facilities nearby. There are no existing tennis courts or sports pitches. So can we assuredly say that what worked for the first site, although they're exactly the same levels, would work for this site too? Both instances, we've hit the guidance values for Sports England and the Dutch guidance, but you can see when you factor context into this, there's an indication of a big risk of drawing complaint, which means that it could be viewed as a significant adverse effect and cause all kinds of headaches for us. So when does this kind of thing need to be considered as part of an application? I don't like coming into an assessment or a project quite late in the stage where I have to start using words like are on the screen now. These are very horrible and expensive words like remedial and mitigation. And usually they can be avoided via early site suitability assessments that then inform decisions and risk profiles and appropriate mitigation strategies. When people instruct noise impact assessments, sometimes they think that what they're buying is a piece of paper with a big green tick on it. What you actually get and what you actually need is a meaningful, coordinated assessment to be shown what you need to do and not what you want to hear. Padel assessments aren't necessarily acoustic centric either. And the earlier that we can speak to the planners, lighting engineers, and other design team members that are involved in the application, the earlier we can present the risks holistically to provide a meaningful list of design considerations for the developers. Initial groundwork paves the way for meaningful, successful developments. So coming towards the end of my part of this presentation, there's some key take-homes for noise that I'd like to get across, and that's To understand the game, the impacts and the risks. Be aware of what noise impact means to the climate you are stepping into. Be aware of current guidance and the strengths and weaknesses of them. Consider context, appropriate methodology, and meaningful design as early as possible. Be informed and prepared when you go into a project to avoid mitigation or remedial works. And lastly, coordinate your development. The interaction between design team members, planners, and stakeholders from the outset will significantly help reduce and minimize risk. Now, thank you very much. That's the end of my part of this webinar. I'd like to now hand over to Ryan, who will discuss lighting with you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you to you as well, Philip, before then. We heard in Philip's presentation where Philip started to introduce some of the potential impacts associated with lighting. So what we're going to do today is just run through very briefly sort of some of the key considerations for lighting and how we can try and avoid some of those kind of pitfalls that are going to potentially trip you up, either pre-planning or, in the worst case scenario, post-planning. If you've managed to get through planning without lighting being scrutinized, how we can kind of make sure that it's implementable. For those of you that have joined along the call since the start and didn't hear introductions in the beginning, my name's Ryan Carroll. I'm an Associate Director at DFL, and I specialise in lighting impact assessment and sensitive lighting strategies. So with regards to Padel projects, the key thing is it's all about understanding the project. It's understanding what level the sport is being played at. In most situations, it's typically going to be recreational, but there are different approaches to lighting depending on whether it's recreational use or whether it's competition level play that's going to be undertaken. We really need to understand how the courts are going to be orientated and configured. As you can see in the images above there or on the screen there, the lighting looks like it's been popped on at the end and is not orientated correctly for those courts. Slight disclaimer, they might be AI generated images, but we'll give it the benefit of the doubt. I thought it was a really good illustration of exactly the key kind of problems that we can face with lighting, especially if you've got, say, non-lighting professionals involved in lighting your courts, particularly at the end, when construction is pretty much complete, and then lighting might get popped on by a contractor or a local electrician, etc. So it's really, really important to make sure that everything has been correctly considered collaboratively, as Ben and Philip have sort of hammered home in their presentations beforehand. We really need to understand quite clearly what sensitive receptors are nearby. And when I say sensitive receptors, we're typically referring to landscape sensitivity, human amenity, any roadways that are adjacent to the site where those transport users might be impacted by glare from the lighting, and ecology as well. We need to know if planning approval has been granted yet, and if that's the case, whether there are any planning conditions that might have been applied. So with the sensitive receptors, we're really interested in human residential, that be nearby houses, and human safety there as well, airports, railways, roads, because we need to make sure that both light spill and glare to those are suitable, not too high. And that is also the same for ecology receptors. And also, if you are in or close to any designated landscapes, such as national landscapes, which were beforehand AONBs, or any dark skies as well. Dark skies are really, really important because that sort of unleashes a whole raft of kind of measures that we really, really need to consider quite carefully for the project, and really does need probably a bit of a step change in the way that a typical Padel project might come forward if you're in a dark sky reserve or very, very close to one. Just had a comment pop in asking if there's a if I'm sharing a screen presentation. I'm hoping that everybody can see it. Ah, brilliant. Thank you. If you can't see it, don't worry too much, because the presentation and the recording of this session will go out at the end. So if you can't see it now, look out for the email coming through, and you'll see, or see it's a few comments in there saying that it's coming through. So do bear with us, and you'll be able to get the follow up at the end there. So with those receptors that we've mentioned, we need to know how sensitive they are. So if you've got sort of human residential that is in a fairly dark area already, then they're going to be fairly sensitive. If you compare that with those that are already in a kind of well lit area, and that kind of changes the sort of how the increase in light levels will affect those receptor groups. With ecology, particularly bats, they're mostly highly sensitive to lighting. There are some species that are not as sensitive, but that's where, from a lighting point of view, collaboration with the ecologist is critical on the project, because they'll be able to sort of advise us which species are present and what levels of light that those species can tolerate. Now, whilst we typically work in accordance with the ILP guidance for bats and lighting, and take a kind of worst case based approach, that can be fettled ever so slightly if there are less light sensitive species of bat on site, and that would kind of be more those bats that are in sort of already sort of urban environments, so sort of pipistrelles and those sorts of species that are kind of quite light tolerant. And then the key thing is that with everything, and it sort of ties back in with what Ben was talking about with noise, that the change in lighting is relevant to the baseline condition. So you need to understand what those receptors are already sort of experiencing from the ambient light levels. Now, environmental zones tie into what I've just said quite nicely, because what you tend to do is you'll look at the environmental zone, map that against the environment in which you are based. So if the paddle court's going into, say, an E2 environmental zone that's more rural, that has sort of low levels of district brightness already, then the limits that we can sort of work to for increasing the background levels of light are much lower than, say, an E4 urban environmental zone, where, so you've got a paddle court going in the city centre on a sports park where there's already lots and lots and lots of ambient light. All the receptors around there are far less sensitive because they've been desensitized by the existing lighting. Then we sort of work in accordance with those environmental zones. It's really important from a planning point of view that when the application goes in for planning, that we can demonstrate that the lighting is being brought forward in accordance with those environmental zones, and that any calculations that have been done from a lighting point of view, light spill calculations, glare calculations, but mostly light spill calculations, that where we're looking at light spill onto residential receptor windows, etc., that they're cumulative. So it means that they include the baseline. So if you've got a residential receptor who is overlooking the facility, then it would certainly be prudent to go and measure what the existing levels of light spill are towards that receptor, so that we can demonstrate, particularly to environmental health officers, that with that existing light level and the addition of the new lighting for the new facility, that won't breach what is acceptable for that environmental zone. There's a little bit in there about maintenance factors for planning. All that basically means is that we're showing the planners what the absolute worst case scenario light spill is from the facility on day one of the light fittings operating, because when we work in lighting, we work to two different ways of really calculating what the end result light levels will be. So typically what we'll do is we'll calculate what the light is going to be doing on your court at the point in time where those light fittings are kind of ready to be replaced, which may be 10 years down the line. In some scenarios, that could be 10 to 15% sort of lower than it would be on day one. So it's just showing that what's being presented is at the absolute worst case. So just on that, with environmental sensitivities, I just wanted to touch upon this this map because most of the projects that you may be involved in, if they're focused in the south of the country and you're kind of experiencing regular pushback on lighting in planning, that's the reason why. So this sort of map shows us across the country what kind of environmental sensitivities we've got, from dark landscapes to dark skies, sensitive ecology receptors, those sorts of things. But that shows us the national landscapes and the national parks in the country. So you can see that in the south we're quite highly concentrated of areas that have those designations, which is absolutely fantastic, and it's great that we've got those landscapes to enjoy. But it does present a challenge for those of you that want to bring paddle courts forward in those environments, particularly from a lighting point of view. So we just need to make sure that all those things that I mentioned about environmental zones are really well considered and complied with, particularly in those brown and pink areas identified on the mapping. So I talked about understanding the planning phase and any conditions. So you pre or post planning approval. I'd say 9 times out of 10 now, most of the projects that we're involved in, we get involved in prior to planning being granted. So some projects that we're involved in come forward in outline, but the vast majority of them are detailed applications, full applications. With outline applications, is it a case of that we can put together something that's a bit more high level, particularly if not all the details are fully known. So there's ways and means of doing that. We can set parameters for lighting and put together strategies that would support that outline application. But from a full application, detailed design sort of stage, that's where we're really focusing on what the light spill looks like and putting everything together in a sort of well considered technical report for those relevant kind of planning authority, for the planning officer, environmental health officer, ecology officer to really be across and understand. If lighting is being left to be dealt with by condition, if you're in that fortunate kind of position where the LPA aren't scrutinising lighting, which is, again, it's becoming far less that we're seeing on projects. But if you are able to do that, just be really mindful that the condition wording doesn't leave you in a scenario where the lighting is not buildable when you bring it forward. So to give you an example, we've seen projects before where the condition will stipulate a blanket lux level, say 0.5 lux, but really what it means is that it doesn't want you to exceed 0.5 lux on a particular receptor. But when you submit all your information to planning, where that's not been clarified in the condition, we have in the past seen some horror stories where it gets stuck in planning because there's a kind of misunderstanding between what that actually relates to as a figure. So it's one to bear in mind there. But if we take the scenario where we're working with you collaboratively with all the other consultants and disciplines, and we're going in, fresh planning application, everything's been provided up front. From a lighting point of view, there's some key standards and guidance that we need to work to. So there's a British standard for sports lighting up on the screen that stipulates the lux levels for Padel. The LTA also have a guidance document as well, but their guidance is aligned with the British standard. And then once you've worked that out, so once you've got your paddle court lighting is working absolutely brilliantly, then we also have to make sure that the environmental guidance is considered as importantly as that functional lighting for the court. So if we come on to what level the sport is being played at, so this ties in with the British standard. So this is where we're talking about the design of the actual functional and operational levels of lighting on the court. For national and international competition levels, the average light levels we need on the court are slightly higher than those for sort of regional or recreational uses. So if you've got a paddle court that's going in for recreational use, you're sort of setting yourself up for a bit of a fall potentially if we're trying to light everything to the highest possible light levels at 500 lux average, where you could really be sort of only needing to worry about focusing on the 300 lux average. So that's it's certainly a consideration. Or being able to flick between the two light levels is also another option that builds in some flexibility into the lighting. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be both on a control system. Now, the two main court types we'll come on to. So uncovered courts. Typically, the lighting for uncovered courts has got more potential to cause what we refer to as obtrusive light. So that's light spill out of the court onto areas where it's not anticipated or not wanted. And you can see in the image there that there's quite a lot of light on the trees. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about vertical light spill. And it's that sort of light that we need to be really conscious of and making sure doesn't impact people's windows. You've got disability and discomfort glare from fittings that are sort of tilted too high. So really, we want fittings to be tilted nice and flat, so they're perpendicular to the playing surface, and that will stop that kind of horrible sort of glare sort of effect that you can see in the image there, particularly towards bedroom windows, and really importantly, adjacent highways and things that might impact road users. If you've got sensitive ecological receptors, as you can see in this image, the light travels a lot further where it's not, where there's no shielding of it. So really, if you've got ecology within about 50 meters of the court boundary, we really need to be considering how that lighting is going to affect that and what mitigation measures we need to bring forward. So we're not saying it's not possible. There's always possibilities. But your out-of-the-box solutions that include light fittings with the court kit may not be suitable in that kind of environment as a one-size-fits-all approach, because the lighting for the padel courts really does need to be considered, on a case-by-case basis. It might be that it works perfectly well, but if it looks like it's not going to work from a light spill perspective, there are options available in terms of looking at more should we say, alternative manufacturers of light fittings then that have the more controls over where they put their light. So that's an option. I've talked about tilt there. Just a note on padel courts with integrated lighting columns. They are great because they fix your positions, and that's perfect. Just bear in mind what it does to the light spill if the columns for the lighting in the framework have got any sort of pitch on them, if they're sort of splayed out or anything. There are some providers that have more of an artistic design to how the columns look. Just make sure that you can still get your fittings nice and flat, because otherwise that can cause your glare to be higher than it should be. Now, we'll come on to canopy covered courts. And of course, canopy covered courts are a good option for mitigating light spill, where you've got the potential for high levels of light spill to impact ecology, or if you need to try and reduce those levels of light, because you can get there's a lot more light containment, if that makes sense, and it can all be modeled and demonstrated to planners that that's possible. But it is worth considering that might have other implications for other consultants. So from an acoustics perspective, we could be hampering the outcomes of the acoustic impact assessment. So it's just making sure that everything's well considered. And likewise, if you've got if you're an acoustic consultant like Ben, and Ben's proposing, say, an acoustic fence around a outdoor cover court, well, it's really good for us to know that, because we can use that as a solid light blocking effect and barrier, and maybe reduce the amount of mitigation that we need to put in. So this is why we talk about collaboration being key there. But yeah, there's a wide variety of canopy court options available. They're predominantly there for as Philip said, extending play and getting play to continue around where there's adverse weather and stuff. They are also, like I say, good for mitigating light pollution. We can also sort of look at different materials and different fabrics, and the effect that has on sort of decreasing light spill through the courts, whilst also maintaining the right levels of daylight, and they do also offer advertising potential as well. So lots of covered canopies with lots of sort of advertising and promotion and stuff like that on them. So it's a good option. There's different lighting options available as well. So within a canopy structure, lighting can be integrated into the main frame structure to light your courts that way, or you can light your courts the same way as you would for outdoor courts and have individual control over every single court. Then, if you're using something like Playtomic to manage your bookings and control. Now, providing the evidence to the council is just a quick whistle-stop tour. So you might see councils asking for light spill diagrams or lux contour plans. This is typically what this is on screen. So there you can see light levels at ground level, sort of spreading out from the paddle court facility. Note the residential houses there. The EHO would be concerned about what the light spill is doing to those windows and what the glare is. So this is only really giving one story. The second part of the story is on screen now. And these tables, you don't necessarily need to be sort of fully understanding of them, but these break down what the actual light spill levels are going to be onto the windows, what the glare is going to be, and how both values are compliant with that environmental zone guidance that I talked to you about. So that's the importance of making sure that everything's correctly assessed and presented. A little bit of outside the box mitigation. Now this shows some tennis courts, but I wanted to include it because it was a project that was sensitive from a landscape perspective, and the main issue was the visibility of the columns during the day. On this particular project, the columns are retractable. Now it's not necessarily to say that because you're going for a paddle court solution that's out of the box kit, that there aren't options available to kind of mitigate some of these issues that might otherwise cause you sort of planning objections. Most paddle court providers and suppliers are more than willing to kind of work with sort of the project team to do what can we do to kind of get this planning approved. And there's other things there like optimizing the lighting design, using the right outputs, using the right heights and tilts, and then we talked about the lighting control systems and demonstrating how those control systems are going to kind of reduce the overall visibility and impact of that lighting, particularly at night time where you've got curfews and things like that need to come into effect. You've got dimming, you've got the ability to switch courts on and off that aren't in use and make sure that lighting is only being utilized as and when it's required. The benefits to that are that it prolongs the life of your lighting equipment, and it's also obviously reducing your energy consumption, carbon footprint, and all the other kind of facets that go with that. So just to round off some key takeaways, collaboration is key. It's all about asking the right questions at the right time and of the right people in your project team, and making sure that you get those people in place to assist you with the project. Light the facility to align with the intended use, so we don't need to go for the absolute highest light levels if we don't really need to. Make sure that we consider what's there already and what's being added doesn't tip that over the edge. And just because we're lighting for sport and there is a need to make sure the sport is lit really well and works as well as it possibly can do to get all of the players really happy with it and a facility that is great, it doesn't mean that we that gives us a free pass on the environmental and human side of things from that kind of that impact side of it. And the two can work really nicely hand in hand as long as everything's considered well from the outset. So it's been a very quick kind of whistle stop tour from a lighting point of view. More than happy to take any questions that you might have in the chat. I haven't seen any come through in the chat, so that's absolutely fine. If you don't feel that you want to ask a question here, that's not a problem at all. Please do reach out to Philip, Ben, or myself individually on the email addresses below that are on your screen if you don't have any questions now. And yeah, thank you all for attending. Really appreciate you joining us today and taking the time to listen to us. Thank you very much to Ben and Philip for co-presenting with me today. Really appreciate your specialist input on your disciplines. And please do look out for the recording that should go out. It should go out automatically, but we may follow up with an email in the coming days just to make sure that everybody's got the recording of the session. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody. Ben, Philip, is there anything else you want to add before we close the session?
No, just A, any questions, please come through, and B, the sun shines, a gorgeous day, so get out there and play paddle.
Absolutely.
And nothing further from me either, but if there are any questions or any discussions anyone wants to have, like Phil and Ryan said, just get in touch and we'd be happy to speak with you.
Excellent stuff. Thank you all, and we'll hopefully see you on another webinar soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.